The alarm sounded at 0347 station time, and I was already awake. I had been awake for the past hour, staring at the dim ceiling of my bunk quarters aboard the Valorian Coalition observation post designated Meridian 7. Something in my gut had refused to let me sleep. I am not a superstitious creature by nature. I am a Valori, a species that has spent 4,000 years building science out of chaos, turning mystery into formula. We do not believe in premonitions. We do not believe in instincts born from nothing. But that night, something pressed against my chest like a stone, and I could not explain it. I reached the operations deck before anyone else except Lieutenant Orvin, who was already leaning over the long-range scanner console with his 4 upper eyes narrowed and his lower 2 wide open. That alone told me something was wrong. Orvin was a calm officer. He was the kind of officer who slept through decompression drills and woke up only when the situation genuinely required him. Seeing him tense before I even reached the console made the stone in my chest grow heavier. "What is it?" I asked. "Single contact," he said, without looking up. It came in from the Calith corridor. No identification signal, no hailing frequency, no broadcast of any kind. I pulled up the secondary screen beside him and looked at the data. The contact was small, smaller than I expected for anything that would trigger our long-range sensors at this distance. It was moving at a speed that our initial system categorized as moderate, not alarmingly fast, not crawling either, just steady, precisely steady, like something that had planned its speed down to the last decimal point and had no intention of changing it. "Coalition registry?" I asked. "Nothing," Orvin said. "I ran it 3 times. "Merchant?" "No commercial markings." "Then it is unauthorized," I said, already reaching for the communication panel to wake Commander Salath. But Orvin put his hand over mine before I touched the button. "I already woke her," he said. "She told me to wait and observe." I looked at him. "Observe what? An unregistered contact in restricted border space?" "She said it was probably a Dravine smuggler, and not worth the paperwork until we had confirmation." I pulled my hand back and looked at the screen again. The contact held its course, dead straight. Not a single navigational adjustment. No wobble. No correction drift. Anything piloted by a living crew made small adjustments constantly. Tiny corrections that showed up as micro-variations in the trajectory line. This contact's line was a ruler edge, smooth and absolute. "That is not a smuggler," I said quietly. Orvin did not answer. He knew I was right. I sat down in the secondary chair and started pulling up every available reference layer the scanner system could give me. Hull composition readings were partial at this range, but even partial data told a story. The hull material was dense, denser than standard coalition military grade, denser than anything the registered merchant classes used. The thermal output was low, very low, almost suspiciously low for a vessel of that mass estimate. It was running cool, cold even. Whatever was powering it was either incredibly efficient or deliberately suppressed. The more I looked, the less I recognized. Behind me, the door opened, and Commander Seelith walked in, still pulling her rank sash across her shoulder. She was a tall Valori, silver-striped, older than most station commanders, with the kind of posture that only came from decades of uniform service. She looked at the main screen, then at Orvin, then at me. "Report," she said. I gave her everything I had in 60 seconds. She listened without interrupting, which was itself unusual. Salath was a woman who interrupted constantly, not from rudeness, but from efficiency. She gathered information the way some people gathered objects, grabbing pieces before you finished handing them over. The fact that she let me finish without a word told me she was already concerned and was not ready to show it yet. "Still no hailing signal from the contact?" she asked when I finished. "None," Orvin said. "And it is holding course?" "Without deviation." She folded her arms and stared at the screen. "Where does the course line terminate?" I had already mapped it. I pulled up the projection and let it draw itself across the star chart. The line extended cleanly from the Calith corridor, through the buffer zone, through the outer perimeter of Meridian 7's patrol boundary, and pointed, without any ambiguity at all, directly at Meridian 7 itself. The room was quiet for a moment. "It is coming here," Seelith said. It was not a question. "The math does not leave room for another conclusion," I said. She stared at the screen for a few seconds longer, then turned and walked to the command chair at the center of the deck. She sat down with the deliberate calm of someone who had decided to appear unafraid, which is the only kind of calm that exists under real pressure. "Wake the full crew," she said. "Bring all scanner arrays to active mode, and get me a confirmed species identification on that vessel." That last order was the one that turned out to be the problem, because we ran the species identification scan 6 times over the next 40 minutes, and every single time it came back with the same result, and every single time I looked at it and felt the stone in my chest turn into something colder and heavier than stone. The hull polymer composition was carbon-titanium hybrid with a ceramic ablative outer layer. The propulsion signature matched a recorded drive type in our database. The electromagnetic output profile was in the files. All of it was in our files, filed under a category that most coalition officers went their entire careers without opening. The category was labeled in our system as a historical archive, a closed record, a chapter of galactic events that the coalition's senior councils had officially declared concluded and sealed 26 years ago. The species was human. I remember looking at that word on my screen and feeling something I had never felt in 16 years of border service. Not fear exactly, not surprise exactly, something quieter and more unsettling than either of those things. It was the feeling you get when you find something in a room that was supposed to be empty, when something is exactly where it should not be, and it arrived there without making a sound. I turned to Commander Seleth and said her name. She was already looking at her own screen. Her silver stripes had gone pale. I did not know that was possible. I had never seen it happen before. Valori's stripe color does not respond to emotion the way some species' skin does. It responds to something older than emotion, something biological, something the body does when the mind sends a signal that says, "This situation is outside the boundaries of what you were prepared for." She looked up from her screen and met my eyes, and for just a moment, Commander Seleth, decorated officer, 22 years of coalition service, a woman who had talked down a Dravine border standoff with nothing but a headset and her own nerve, looked genuinely uncertain. "They were supposed to be contained," she said. And that one sentence told me more about what was really happening than anything the scanner had shown me. Because contained is not the same word as defeated. Contained is not the same word as gone. Contained means restrained. Contained means held in place by something. And whatever had been holding humans in place for the past 26 years, whatever had kept them quiet and absent from the wider galaxy, whatever had let the coalition spend more than 2 decades telling everyone, including themselves, that the human question had been resolved and settled and filed away in a closed historical archive. Something had changed. Or perhaps nothing had changed. Perhaps the humans had simply decided that the time had come, and the difference between those two possibilities felt, in that moment, extremely important and completely impossible to determine. The contact held its course, dead straight, cold running, ruler edge perfect, coming toward us without a word. I pulled up the classified archive files that the coalition had sealed 26 years ago and started reading. Not because I had authorization, I did not, but because Seleth had not told me to stop, and because somewhere behind the professional training and the rank insignia and the careful scientific mind I had spent my whole adult life building, there was something older and simpler that said, "You need to know what is coming." I read for 30 minutes, while the human ship grew steadily larger on the scanner screen. What I found in those files made everything worse. Not because humans were monsters. The files did not describe monsters. They described something that in some ways was much harder to process than monsters would have been. They described a species that had arrived at the edge of galactic civilization 40 years ago, young and loud and full of the particular confidence that comes from having survived on a dangerous world long enough to reach the stars. They had reached out. They had offered alliance. They had come with open signals and translation attempts, and what their own records described as goodwill. The coalition had looked at them and seen something small, something manageable, something that could be directed and limited and kept in a useful but controlled position, while the older, more established powers of the galaxy made the real decisions. That calculation had not gone well. The details of what happened next were redacted in large sections. Pages and pages of black bars, but the outline was clear enough. There had been a confrontation. The coalition had expected compliance and received something else entirely. There had been a period the files called the Caliph response, named for the same corridor the human ship had just come out of, and the files around that event were the most heavily redacted of all. But the aftermath was documented clearly. The coalition had pulled back. The humans had pulled back. A containment agreement had been reached, sealed, and officially classified as a resolved dispute. The humans had gone quiet, and the galaxy had decided that quiet meant gone. I closed the archive file and looked at the screen. The ship was close enough now that our short-range arrays were beginning to resolve its shape. It was not large. By coalition military standards, it was actually quite small. But it was built in a way that made its size irrelevant to look at. Every line of it was functional, nothing wasted, nothing decorative. It was the shape of something that had been designed by people who had thought very carefully about exactly what they needed, and had built precisely that, and nothing more. "It is hailing us," Orvin said suddenly. The entire deck went still. Selath straightened in her chair. "Put it through." The communication channel opened. There was a moment of static, and then a human voice filled the room. It was calm, completely, almost unreasonably calm. Not the calm of someone performing bravery, the calm of someone who had already done all their thinking and was simply delivering the conclusion. The voice said, "You are standing in the place where our people were left to disappear. We have come to collect what is ours. We are not asking for permission. We wanted you to know we were coming, so we are telling you now. This is a courtesy. It is the only one we plan to extend." Then the channel closed. Nobody on the deck spoke. I looked at the screen. The human ship had not slowed down. It had not adjusted its course. It was still holding that ruler edge line, running cold and quiet and steady, and it was not stopping. Selath said my name. Her voice was very level. "Get me everything we have on that ship's specifications," she said, "and send an emergency signal to Coalition Central Command. Priority 1. I was already moving, but as my hands worked the console, I could not stop thinking about one word from the archive file. One word that I kept turning over in my mind, like a stone you find on the ground and cannot quite put down. Contained. That was what the Coalition had called it 26 years ago. And now, watching that small, precise, cold-running ship hold its perfect course toward us without hesitation and without a single request for permission, I found myself wondering something that I suspected was going to keep me awake for a very long time. Who exactly had been containing whom? The scanner chimed. The human ship was now within visual range, and it was not alone. I had spent 16 years in Coalition border service, telling myself that I had seen everything worth seeing. I had been on station during the Dravine fuel riots. I had watched a Porith colony ship break apart on the wrong side of a gravity well. I had sat at a scanner console while 2 Melek warfleets circled each other for 9 days before someone blinked. I had processed enough crisis signals, distress calls, and territorial disputes to fill 3 careers, and I had done it all with the measured professionalism that the Valori Coalition expected from its officers. None of that had prepared me for what I was looking at now. The human ship, the single contact we had been tracking for the past 2 hours, the small, precise vessel that we had categorized and analyzed and run species identification on 6 times, was not alone. It had never been alone. We simply had not been looking in the right places. Orvin found the others first. He did not announce it loudly. He did not need to. He just said my name in a very quiet voice, and I looked at his screen, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. They were holding position at the edge of scanner range, spread across a volume of space so wide that our arrays had initially categorized the faint returns as background scatter. That is how they had done it. Not by hiding behind anything physical, not by using technology we could point to and label. They had simply positioned themselves at the exact boundary where our systems would naturally discount what they were seeing as noise. The returns were too faint, too spread, too evenly distributed. Our scanners had looked at them and said, "Not relevant." They were relevant. I counted 14 contacts before Orvin recalibrated the sensitivity arrays, and the number jumped. Then jumped again. By the time the system finished its updated sweep and settled on a final count, we were looking at 31 vessels holding position in a loose, deliberate formation at the edge of our detection range. None of them were hailing us. None of them were moving. They were simply there, the way a fact is there, present, patient, and not in any particular hurry to be acknowledged. Commander Selath stood behind me and Orvin for a long time without speaking. I could hear her breathing change. A slow, controlled exhale that she probably thought was inaudible. Size classification, she said. I ran the estimates. With the distance involved and the deliberate suppression of their thermal output, the numbers had margins of error I would not normally accept. But the midpoint estimates were consistent enough to tell a story. The vessels ranged from the same class as the lead ship, small, precise, cold-running, up to 2 contacts at the far edge of the formation that our mass estimates put in a category well above anything we had in the regional coalition fleet. The 2 large ones, Selath said, studying the screen. Do they match any registered class in our database? No, I said. The mass estimates and the hull composition returns do not match any human vessel class in our archives. Because the archives are 26 years old, Orvin said. Nobody argued with that. We all knew what it meant. 26 years of silence. 26 years during which the wider galaxy had looked at the sealed files, looked at the absence of human signals in the usual channels, and concluded that the situation had resolved itself into something manageable, something quiet, something that stayed where it was put. The galaxy had been wrong. I pulled up the lead ship's visual feed on the main screen and let the image processors sharpen it as far as they could. The hull was dark, not painted dark, but coated with something that absorbed light in a way that made it difficult to focus on. The lines were clean and economical. There were protrusions along the dorsal surface that my weapons identification system wanted to categorize as armament arrays, but the shapes were unfamiliar enough that the system kept returning uncertain flags. Either the weapons were of a design type not in our records, or they were something else entirely that my system was misreading as weapons. Neither option was entirely reassuring. And then, there was the marking on the hull. It was the only decoration on the entire vessel, a simple design near the bow, rendered in a color just bright enough to be visible against the light-absorbing coat. I had the image processors zoom in and enhance until the design was clear, and then I sat with it for a moment, trying to understand what I was looking at. It was a hand, an open human hand, facing outward. Around it, in a circular arrangement, were words in the human script that our translation archives could partially decode. Orvin read them over my shoulder. He was better with human script than I was. He had spent 3 years at a translation outpost early in his career and had developed a working knowledge of several human languages as a result. He read the words twice, quietly, and then he said them aloud. We remember. We came back. Count carefully. None of us spoke for several seconds. Count carefully. Selath repeated. What does that mean? I think, Orvin said, very slowly, that it means exactly what it says. The lead ship continued its approach. It had not slowed. The 31 vessels at the edge of scanner range had not moved. Everything was holding in a state of deliberate, patient stillness that felt less like a standoff and more like a demonstration, like something being shown to us that we were meant to understand. I went back to the archive files. Not the redacted sections. I had spent enough time with those to know that the black bars were not going to give me what I needed. Instead, I went to the periphery, the sections around the redactions, the footnotes and supplementary records and secondary reports that the councils had considered too minor to bother removing when they sealed the main file, the details that no one expected anyone to dig into, because the official conclusion was right there on the front page, and why would you go further? I went further. I found a record filed by a coalition translator, assigned to the early human contact missions 40 years ago. Her name was in the file, but I will not use it here. What matters is what she wrote. She had been one of the first coalition personnel to have direct, extended contact with human representatives, back when the relationship was new, and the coalition was still in the stage of deciding what to make of these small, loud, energetic creatures from a single blue-green world on the galactic rim. She wrote about many things: the humans' rate of language acquisition, which she described as startling, their habit of asking questions that were technically simple but philosophically complex, questions that seemed naive until you tried to answer them and realized they were not naive at all, their tendency to build relationships quickly and take the breaking of those relationships very seriously. She wrote one paragraph that I read 3 times before I moved past it. She wrote that what most coalition personnel failed to understand about humans was their relationship with time. Not in the abstract sense, not philosophy or religion or any of the various frameworks different species use to think about the passage of time. In the practical sense. In the sense of what they did with it. Humans, she wrote, did not forget. Not as a cultural value, not as an aspiration, but as a genuine functional characteristic of how they processed experience. They remembered things with a clarity and emotional vividness that persisted across decades. They built institutions specifically designed to make sure that even things they could not personally remember, things that happened before they were born, would still be preserved, and taught, and carried forward. They had a concept they called historical justice, and they applied it across generations with a consistency that she had initially found baffling, until she realized it was simply what happened when a species took memory this seriously. She ended the paragraph with a personal note. She wrote that she had, in her time with human representatives, made a small error in one of their shared working sessions, something minor, a mistranslation that had caused a brief awkward moment that was quickly corrected, an insignificant thing. She had not thought of it again. 2 years later, near the end of her assignment, a human colleague had brought it up unprompted, mentioning it gently, not as an accusation, but as a callback, a piece of shared history they had together. The colleague had remembered it exactly. Precisely. Every detail. The translator wrote that she had found this touching at the time, a small warmth between colleagues across species lines. It was only later, much later, after the Kaleth response, and the sealing of the files, and the coalition's official declaration, that the matter was resolved, that she looked back on that moment, and understood what it actually meant. Humans did not forget the small things, which meant they certainly did not forget the large ones. I closed the file. On the main screen, the lead ship was close enough now that our visual systems were resolving the texture of its hull without enhancement. I could see the fine seams where hull plates joined. I could see the subtle variations in the light-absorbing coat where it had been applied in overlapping sections. Up close, the ship had a quality that was difficult to name precisely. It looked used, not damaged, not worn out. Used, the way a tool is used, evidence of purpose, evidence of sustained effort, evidence of something that had been working steadily for a long time. The communication channel opened again. The same voice as before, still calm, still unhurried. "We know you found the others," the voice said. "We wanted you to find them. We are not hiding. We have not been hiding for quite some time now. We understand that is surprising. We also understand that you are sending emergency signals to your central command right now. Please continue doing that. It will be helpful." A pause. Then, "We want to speak with whoever is in charge of this station, not by signal, in person. We are sending a transport. It will arrive in 40 minutes. We ask that you receive it." The channel closed. Selath turned to look at me, and I looked at her. Her stripes were still pale, but her eyes were steady. She had moved from the first phase of the crisis, the internal one, the one that lives behind the face, to the second phase, the one where you decide what to do with yourself. "Are we going to receive the transport?" I asked. "I do not see that we have a better option," she said. "They are already here. Refusing to talk to them does not make them less here." That was the most honest thing I heard anyone say that day, and it was the thing I kept coming back to in the hours that followed. They were already here. Whatever the coalition had believed for 26 years, whatever the sealed files had been meant to suggest, whatever comfortable story the galaxy had been telling itself about the human situation being contained and managed and finished, none of it had made any of this less real. It had only made it more surprising. The transport arrived exactly on schedule, 40 minutes, to the second. I know this because I watched the clock. I do not know exactly why I watched the clock. Perhaps because when everything else about a situation is uncertain, a schedule being kept is at least one thing you can measure, and it was kept, perfectly. The transport was small, designed for a crew of perhaps 4 or 5. It docked at Meridian 7's secondary bay, without any navigational assistance from our side, which was itself a quiet statement. Docking at an unfamiliar station without guidance was not a particularly complex maneuver, but it required familiarity with the general design standards of coalition infrastructure, which meant the humans had that familiarity, which meant they had done their research. Or perhaps they had simply remembered. Selath went to meet them at the docking bay herself. I went with her. along with Orvan and 2 station security officers whose presence felt simultaneously necessary and slightly absurd given the circumstances. We stood in the bay and watched the transport's hatch open. 3 humans came out. I had seen images of humans in the archive files, still images, a few short recordings from the early contact period. But images and recordings are flat things, and humans in person were not flat at all. They were compact and upright, with a physical presence that did not match their size. Not aggressive, nothing in their body language was aggressive. They moved with an ease and deliberateness that reminded me, oddly, of the way Seleth moved when she was most confident, like people who had thought carefully about where they were going and had no reservations about going there. The one in front was a man. Medium height, dark hair showing threads of gray at the sides, eyes that were a shade of brown that humans called warm, but which I found difficult to categorize by Valori color standards. He wore a uniform that was dark and undecorated, except for a small version of the same open-hand insignia that was on the ship's hull. He looked at Seleth, and then at the rest of us, with an expression that I can only describe as polite attention, the look of someone who is taking careful note of everything they are seeing and choosing not to say so directly. He said, "Thank you for receiving us. My name is Owen Carr. I represent the Terran Continuity Authority." He paused. "I know you do not have that name in your files. It is new." Then he looked at the room in general, calmly, and said something that I have turned over in my mind every day since. "We were not gone," he said. "We were waiting. There is a difference, and we are here today because we think it is important that the distinction be understood." Nobody in our group responded immediately. There was a moment of silence that was not uncomfortable. Exactly. It was more like the silence that follows a statement that is still being processed. Then Commander Seleth, who had 22 years of coalition service, and who had talked down a Dravine border standoff, with nothing but a headset and her own nerve, extended her hand toward Owen Carr. In the human greeting gesture, she had clearly looked up at some point in the last 40 minutes. He shook it. Behind him, the 31 vessels at the edge of our scanner range still had not moved. The lead ship was still holding station just outside the perimeter. Everything was still. Everything was patient. And somewhere in the sealed archives of the Coalition's central records, a file that had been labeled concluded and resolved and closed for 26 years, was about to become the most important document in the galaxy. What Commander Seleth did next was something I will always respect her for, even now, looking back with all the context I have gained since. She brought Owen Carr and his 2 colleagues, a woman named Lydia Holt and a younger man named Patrick Gaines, directly to the station's conference room and sat them down across from herself and her senior staff. And she did not pretend. She did not open with diplomatic pleasantries. She did not offer the traditional Valori ceremonial greeting sequence, which would have taken 12 minutes and accomplished nothing, except to use up time neither side needed to waste. She sat down, she looked at Owen Carr, and she said, "Tell me what you need from this conversation." It was the right question. Not what do you want, which implies desire, which can be managed and redirected. What do you need, which implies purpose, which must be addressed. Owen Carr looked at her for a moment, with that same expression of polite attention, and I had the distinct impression that she had just passed some kind of test that neither of them had announced in advance. "Acknowledgement," he said. "That is the beginning. What happened in the Calith corridor 26 years ago needs to be acknowledged. Not privately, publicly. In the official record of the Coalition." Seleth did not flinch. "What else?" "Access. Human vessels have been barred from 47 Coalition-designated transit corridors since the containment agreement. Those restrictions are lifted immediately. Not renegotiated. Lifted. And beyond that?" Carr was quiet for a moment, not hesitating. He clearly knew exactly what he wanted to say. He was choosing how to say it. "Beyond that," he said carefully, "there is a question of what the Coalition is actually made of, whether it is a body of genuine partnership between species, or whether it is an arrangement that pretends to be partnership while being something else. The answer to that question will determine everything that comes after this conversation." The room was quiet. Lydia Holt, sitting to Carr's left, had said nothing since they arrived. She was quieter than him, not in a passive way, but in the way of someone who was listening with great intensity, and would speak when speaking was more useful than listening. She had a reader device on the table in front of her, and every few minutes her eyes dropped to it briefly. I could not see what was on the screen. Patrick Gaines, the youngest of the three, was sitting very straight. He was watching our faces with a frankness that some of my colleagues found uncomfortable. He was probably not much older than some of the junior staff sitting behind Salath. He had the look of someone who had grown up being told that this day was coming, and had spent his life getting ready for it. And now that it was here, he was not going to miss a single detail. Salath said, "I am an observation post commander. I am not in a position to commit the coalition to policy changes of the scope you are describing." "I know," Carr said. "That is why we sent the emergency signal for you. Your central command is going to receive it within the hour. We are not asking you to make those decisions. We are asking you to be the first point of contact, the beginning of a conversation that is going to happen, regardless of how any individual station commander responds to it." He said it without arrogance. That was the thing I kept noticing. Everything he said was stated with a quiet certainty that had nothing in it of threat or boast. It was the certainty of someone presenting facts, not the certainty of someone trying to win an argument. Salath folded her hands on the table.
"You came with 31 vessels."
32, Carr said pleasantly. "You missed one. It is smaller than the others. We designed it to be missable." The junior staff behind Salath exchanged glances. Orvin went very still beside me. "Why?" Salath asked. "Because in any complex situation," Carr said, "it is useful to know what a party notices and what it overlooks. We were not going to use that information against you. We just wanted it." Salath studied him. "That is either very honest or a very clever thing to tell us after the fact." Carr smiled. It was a small, genuine smile, not the polished expression of a diplomat. "It is both," he said. "We find that is often how the most useful things are." Lydia Holt spoke for the first time. Her voice was lower than I expected, measured and precise. "I want to address something that has probably come up in your preparation for this meeting," she said, looking at Seleth. "I want to address the Caliph response directly, because I think dancing around it will make everything else harder." Seleth met her eyes. "Then address it." Holt placed both hands flat on the table. 26 years ago, a coalition fleet entered human-designated space without authorization, under the authority of what your records call the Meridian Compact, which human representatives were never asked to ratify. The fleet was acting on instructions to assess human military capacity, and if that capacity was found to exceed certain thresholds, to impose navigational and developmental restrictions, which is a careful way of saying to limit what humans were allowed to build and where humans were allowed to go. Nobody on our side of the table said anything. The human ships in that corridor defended themselves, Holt continued. Your files call what followed an engagement. Our files call it something different. But the outcome was what it was, and the coalition subsequently reclassified the entire event as a resolved border dispute and sealed the records. She paused. The humans who were in that corridor were not consulted about what the event would be called. They were not part of the decision to seal the records. They were simply told, by the practical reality of an imposed containment agreement, that the galaxy had decided the matter was finished, Salath said, and the coalition believed that all parties were satisfied with that resolution. Holt looked at her steadily. The coalition believed what was convenient to believe. It was the plainest thing said in that room all day, and it landed the way plain things land when everyone already knows they are true. Patrick Gaines leaned forward slightly, speaking for the first time. His voice was younger than the other two, not inexperienced but not yet worn smooth by years of formal exchange. There was something direct about it that I found, unexpectedly, easier to listen to than the more measured tones of his senior colleagues. "Can I ask something?" he said, looking at me specifically. I was surprised to be singled out. "Yes," I said. "When you found the ship on your scanner tonight, before you knew it was human, what was your first instinct? Not your training response. Your first instinct." I thought about that. I thought about the stone in my chest, and Orvin's pale expression, and the ruler-edge trajectory line on the scanner. That something was wrong, I said. That whatever was coming should not have been where it was. He nodded slowly. "And when you found out it was human, did that answer the question? Did knowing who we were tell you why we were here?" I was quiet for a moment. "No," I said. "It made the question larger." He sat back. That is what we are trying to address, he said. Not just the events of 26 years ago, not just the transit restrictions or the sealed files. The question of why the galaxy's first instinct, when it saw something that did not fit its expectations, was that it should not be where it was. That is the question your records have never asked, and we are here to ask it. The silence after that was a different kind than the silences that had come before. It was the silence of a room in which something had been said that everyone understood was going to be very hard to argue with. Selath took a long breath and let it out slowly. Then she turned to her communications officer. "Open a priority channel to Central Command," she said. "Tell them I have human representatives aboard Meridian 7, and that this situation requires immediate council-level attention." She looked back at Owen Carr, and there was something in her expression that was not yet trust, and was not quite its opposite either. It was the look of someone beginning to adjust to a new reality, with as much dignity as they can manage. "This will take time," she said. "We have time," Carr said. And then, quietly, with no particular emphasis, "We have been patient for 26 years. We can be patient for whatever this requires." Outside, through the observation port at the end of the conference room, the lead human ship was clearly visible now, dark and still and precisely positioned, not threatening, not retreating, simply present, with the absolute certainty of something that had always known it was going to be here. I watched it for a long time while the conversation continued around me, and I thought about the translator's file, and the word that humans used for what they did with the things that mattered to them. They remembered. And the galaxy had made the fatal error of deciding that because they were quiet, they were finished. Because they had stopped being loud, they had stopped being a consideration. Because the files were sealed and the category was labeled historical, and the official position was that the matter was resolved. The matter was actually resolved. It was not resolved. It had never been resolved. It had only been renamed. And now the thing that had been renamed was sitting in a conference room on Meridian 7, with 3 human representatives and a direct channel open to Coalition Central Command, and it was going to be very clearly, very thoroughly, very patiently unrenamed. I thought about the 32 vessels at the edge of our scanner range. 32. We had counted 31 and been confident. They had known we would count 31 and be confident. That one missing count, that single vessel designed to be overlooked, felt less like a tactical demonstration and more like a message addressed specifically to the part of the galaxy that had spent 26 years overlooking things it should have been counting. Behind me, Selath's communication channel to Central Command connected. I heard her begin to speak. And somewhere in the sealed archives of galactic history, the first page of a new chapter was already being written, not by the Coalition, and not by any council, but by the simple and irresistible fact of what was happening in this room, on this station, on this particular night, when the humans stopped waiting and came back to make the galaxy count more carefully. The Coalition Central Command did not respond immediately to Selath's priority signal. They took 11 minutes, which in Coalition Emergency Communication Protocol represented the maximum allowable delay for a Priority 1 situation. I noted that. 11 minutes to respond to a message that said humans were present in force at a border station was 11 minutes of someone somewhere deciding how to feel about that before deciding how to respond. What they sent back was not a senior commander. It was an administrative liaison officer named one would have expected to be dispatching a defense coordinator at minimum. The fact that they sent a liaison told Owen Carr something, and he did not hide that it told him something. He simply noted it with a small, almost imperceptible nod, and made a quiet notation on his own device. The liaison's name was Brennan, and he was not present in the room. He appeared on the communication screen at the end of the conference table, and from the first moment his image resolved, I could see that he was not prepared for what he was looking at. He had clearly been told there were human representatives at Meridian 7. He had not been told what they would look like across a table in the direct, patient way that Owen Carr looked across a table. Or perhaps he had been told, and the telling had not been sufficient. Carr watched Brennan's initial hesitation with the expression of someone watching something they expected. "Council Liaison," Selath said. "I have 3 representatives of an organization called the Terran Continuity Authority aboard this station. They are requesting formal acknowledgement of events that occurred in the Kaleth corridor, 26 years ago, and immediate review of what they describe as unlawful navigational restrictions imposed on human vessels." The liaison blinked. Commander, the events you are referencing are classified and sealed under Council resolution. I know what they are classified under, Selath said. There was something new in her voice. She was still controlled, still professionally composed, but the edge beneath it was sharper than I had heard before. I am informing you that the representatives sitting across from me have outlined the substance of those sealed events in detail that suggest the classification has not prevented the information from being known. They know what happened. They are not asking for us to tell them. They are asking for us to acknowledge it officially. Another pause from the liaison, a longer one this time. Owen Carr leaned slightly forward. If it is helpful, he said toward the screen, I can save you some time. We are not going to go away. We are not going to reduce our presence in this sector while we wait for the Council to deliberate. We are not going to be contained again. Those are not negotiating positions. They are simply what is true. What the Council decides in the next few hours is going to determine whether this proceeds as a conversation or as something that becomes harder to have as a conversation the longer it is delayed. Brennan looked at Carr. Then he looked at Selath. Then he did something that administrative liaison officers almost never do in the middle of an official communication, which was to reach off screen and have what was clearly a brief, intense, quiet exchange with someone outside the frame. When he turned back, his face had a different quality, not more comfortable, less comfortable, in a way that suggested he had just been told something that required him to be less comfortable. I am going to need to escalate this to senior council level, he said. There will be a delay. How long? Selath asked. Several hours. Possibly into the next day, Carr said. We have waited 26 years. Several hours is not a problem. The liaison was quiet for a moment. I appreciate your patience, he said, and the words sounded strange in the room, given everything that surrounded them. You should, Carr said, and then he said nothing more. The communication ended. What happened in the hours that followed has since become the subject of considerable formal documentation, so I will not try to reconstruct the full sequence of messages and counter-messages and internal coalition deliberations that took place while the human delegation waited in Meridian 7's conference room. What I will describe is what I personally witnessed, because that is the part of the record that is otherwise invisible. I watched Owen Carr sit in that conference room for 4.5 hours. He was not performing patience. He was simply patient, in the way that someone is patient when they have genuinely made peace with waiting, because they know the outcome is already determined by things that have already happened. He ate the food that our station's kitchen prepared for the delegation. Simple things, nothing elaborate, and he ate with the focused attention of someone who was respecting the effort that had gone into the preparation. He spoke with Lydia Holt and Patrick Gaines in low, brief exchanges that I could not fully hear across the room, and occasionally he read from his device, and twice he walked to the observation window and stood there looking at the lead ship for several minutes before returning to the table. At one point, Patrick Gaines came and stood near where I was sitting, across the room from the main group. He was looking at the star chart display on the wall, which showed our current position relative to the wider sector geography. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were working steadily across the display. Can I ask you something? He said, without looking away from the chart. You can ask, I said. How long have you been on this station? 11 years, I said. He nodded. Then you were here when the containment agreement was in effect. I was, I said, though I did not know the full details of what the agreement was or how it had come to exist. It was not something that was discussed. He turned to look at me then. Did you wonder about it? It was a question I had to think about honestly, because it deserved an honest answer. I noticed the category in the archive system was sealed, I said. I noticed that any time human-related topics came up in operational briefings, they were addressed briefly and then moved past. I noticed there was a certain practiced way that senior officers had of acknowledging the topic and then closing it. I paused. I suppose I assumed there was a reason. There was a reason, Gaines said. The reason was that if no one asked about it long enough, eventually no one would. I looked at him. And you were going to ask about it. Eventually, he said, when we were ready. He glanced at the observation window. We wanted to be ready first. He went back to the table after that, and I sat with what he had said for a long time. When we were ready, not when the time was right, not when the opportunity arose, when we were ready. There was an implication in that phrasing that I found increasingly significant as the hours passed. It implied that the humans had spent the past 26 years in a deliberate process of preparation. Not reaction, not patience born of powerlessness, but the active use of time by a species that understood time in the particular way the translator's file had described. They had taken what they were given, which was isolation and restriction, and the galaxy's confident dismissal, and they had treated it as an interval. Intervals have ends. This one had ended tonight. At approximately 0320 station time, nearly 3 hours after the Coalition liaison's promise of escalation, a new face appeared on the communication screen. This one I recognized. Senior Council Representative Marin Aldous, who held authority over external affairs on the Eastern Coalition Council, was a Valori elder whose image appeared in official broadcasts often enough that even junior officers knew her face. She had the particular stillness of very senior officials who had learned that absolute stillness was its own kind of power. She looked at Owen Carr for a long moment before she spoke. He looked back at her with complete composure. "Mr. Carr," she said, "I am told you represent an organization called the Terran Continuity Authority." "That is correct," he said. "I am also told that you arrived in this sector with 32 vessels, and that you have made certain requests of the Coalition that your delegation characterizes as non-negotiable." "Some of them," Carr said. "Others are the beginning of a negotiation. We can be clear about which is which." Aldous was quiet for a moment. "I would like to understand your basis for describing any request as non-negotiable when you are speaking with a post commander rather than the full council." Carr tilted his head slightly. "With respect, Council Representative, my basis is the 31 vessels you can see on your scanner data, and the one you cannot. My basis is 26 years of work that the Coalition has not been aware of, because it has been categorizing our absence as irrelevance, rather than as preparation. My basis is this conversation happening at all, which would not be happening if our basis were not sufficient." He paused. "I do not say this to be difficult. I say it because clarity now will save time later, and I think everyone involved would prefer to save time." Something moved in Aldous' expression. Not concession, not yet, but something in the neighborhood of it. The recalibration of a very experienced official who has encountered a situation that her experience did not fully predict. "What is the Terran Continuity Authority?" she asked. "It is the governing body of the 47 human worlds," Carr said. The number landed in the room with a weight that I felt physically. 47 worlds. Not one. Not the single blue-green world of the original archives. 47. Aldous said, "The Coalition's records do not show 47 human worlds." "The Coalition's records are 26 years old," Carr said, and the echo of what Orvin had said hours earlier, in a completely different tone, about completely different data, was not lost on me. "We have been building. We have been settling. We have been doing, for 26 years, exactly what the Coalition prevented us from doing when it restricted our movement and our development. And then we found ways to do it anyway, outside the corridors you restricted, in the spaces you did not think to watch, with the time that the isolation gave us, and that we chose to use rather than waste." 47 worlds, Aldous said again, and this time she was not repeating it for information. She was repeating it because it needed to be said out loud, more than once, to begin to feel real. 47 at present, Carr said. "We are not finished." The communication was quiet for a long beat. I could hear, somewhere in the background of Aldous' feed, the sound of what I was fairly sure was controlled, rapid discussion among people just off-screen, officials gathering information, analysts updating assessments, a galactic power structure beginning to understand, piece by piece, that the picture of the galaxy it had been working from had a very significant gap in it. Aldous said, "I need to consult with the full council. I will return to this communication within 2 hours." "We will be here," Carr said. The screen went dark. Lydia Holt leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. Patrick Gaines exhaled slowly. Owen Carr sat very still for a moment, and then he reached across the table and poured himself a glass of water from the container our staff had left there, and he drank it calmly, and he set the glass back down. 2 hours, Selath said, to no one in particular. "They need to verify it," Carr said. "We expected this. They will send scanner arrays and listening posts, and every piece of intelligence infrastructure they can deploy in the next 2 hours to try to confirm or disprove the 47 number. What they find will tell them that the number is accurate, and probably that it is slightly conservative, because our count is as of 6 months ago, and some of the newer settlements have grown faster than the initial projections. Salath looked at him steadily. "You are very calm," she said. "We have been preparing for this conversation for a long time," he said. "There is nothing in this room that we have not thought about." Outside, through the observation window, the human ships held their positions. 47 worlds. The sealed archive files and their black bar redactions, and their official language about resolved disputes and contained situations. The translator's notes about memory, about the way humans carried the things that happened to them across time, the way they built institutions specifically to ensure that even things that happened before any living person was born would still be known and taught and passed on. 47 worlds, built in silence, in the spaces the galaxy had not thought to watch, with the time that isolation gave them. We had thought silence meant finished. We had heard quiet and called it over. It was not over. It was the sound of something being built. Senior Council Representative Marin Aldous returned in 93 minutes. Not the 2 hours she had asked for. 93 minutes, which in the context of Coalition Council deliberation was the functional equivalent of running. I know what she found in those 93 minutes because the intelligence reports were later made available through the formal disclosure process that the subsequent negotiations required. The scanner arrays that were quietly deployed during her consultation period returned exactly what Owen Carr had predicted. 47 confirmed human settlement zones in previously uncategorized or lightly monitored space. Not all of them were fully developed. Some were early-stage colonies, establishing infrastructure rather than complete civilizations. But all of them were real, and all of them were occupied, and all of them had the particular look, in scanner data, of places that had been built with a plan, rather than stumbled into. The 2 large vessels at the edge of Meridian 7's scanner range were confirmed, in those 93 minutes, to be of a class that had no coalition equivalent, not marginally more advanced, categorically different in their drive signature, their hull composition, their power output, and the navigational range implied by their fuel capacity. Ships designed for deep, extended operation. Ships designed to go far and stay out for a long time. Ships that, in the 26 years since the coalition had decided the human situation was resolved, had been quietly, patiently designed and built and crewed and stationed at a position where they would be found at exactly the right moment. When Aldous reappeared on the screen, her stillness was of a different quality than before. Before, it had been the stillness of authority. Now it was the stillness of someone who was being extremely careful. She said, "I have consulted with the full council. We are prepared to enter into formal discussions on the matters you have raised, Mr. Carr. We propose a formal summit session within the next 30 days, at a neutral location to be agreed upon." Carr said, "We agree to a summit within 30 days. We propose the location be in human-designated space, on a world of our choosing." Aldous said, "That is an unconventional proposal." "Yes," Carr said, "it is also the proposal we are making." Another pause. Another off-screen consultation that I could hear without being able to follow. "Which world?" Aldous said. Carr looked at Lydia Holt. She gave him a very small nod. "We call it New Calith," Carr said. "It is in the corridor that your records list as the site of the events of 26 years ago. We think the location is appropriate." The silence on the other end of the communication lasted long enough that I began to count seconds. Aldous said, "We will consider the location." "That is all we are asking," Carr said, "that things be considered." After the communication ended for the second time, the conference room had the quality that rooms have after very large things have been said in them, a kind of residual weight, as if the air itself was still processing the words. Seleth sat very straight in her chair, and did not speak for almost a minute. Her senior staff waited. Even the sounds of the station seemed muted, as if the building itself was paying attention. Then she looked at Owen Carr, and said something that surprised me, coming from her. It surprised me because it was not a question a station commander asks a foreign representative in a formal context. It was a question that came from somewhere more personal than protocol. She said, What would have happened if we had not received your transport tonight? Carr looked at her for a moment. We would have waited at the edge of your scanner range until you did, he said. And then we would have come back the next day. And the day after that. For as long as it took. And if the coalition had responded with force. Carr was quiet for a moment. Not because he did not have an answer. I could see that he had an answer. And that he was deciding how much of it to share. We did not come here to fight, he said finally. That is the honest answer. We came here to be acknowledged, and to begin a process that is long overdue. He paused. But I will also say this. We did not come unprepared. We spent 26 years not being unprepared. If the coalition had chosen to respond in a way that required a different kind of response, we were ready to give it. He met Selath's eyes steadily. We hoped it would not come to that. We are glad it has not. Selath nodded slowly. As am I, she said. Something passed between them in that moment that was not yet friendship and was not yet trust, but was perhaps the first small beginning of what either of those things is made from. The moment when two parties in a difficult situation acknowledge each other as real, as serious, as worthy of honesty. Patrick Gaines was looking at the star chart again. He had returned to it several times during the night, and I had begun to understand why. It was a coalition-produced chart, which meant that the way the galaxy was divided, labeled and organized on it, reflected coalition priorities and coalition perspectives. Human space on that chart was a small, lightly annotated region at the rim. It had no major corridor markings. Its worlds were not individually labeled. It was the cartographic equivalent of the sealed archive file, a part of the galaxy that had been deliberately kept small in the official picture. He was looking at that small region on the chart, and I watched his expression, and I tried to imagine what it felt like to look at a map of the galaxy and see your people represented as a footnote. To know that for 26 years, the rest of the galaxy had been looking at a version of reality that wrote you as minor and peripheral and contained. And then to come here, to arrive in the places that the map called the center, with 32 ships and 47 worlds, and a governance body that did not exist in any coalition database, and to sit down at a table and say, carefully and clearly and without anger, we are not a footnote. We never were. We were just quiet. I thought about the translator's report again, the paragraph about human memory, about the way they carried things across time, about institutions built specifically to ensure that even things that happened before any living person was born would still be known. The Terran Continuity Authority. The name itself was a document. Continuity. The insistence that there was no break, no interruption, no gap in the story. Only a period during which the galaxy had not been looking, and during which the humans had kept going anyway. Owen Carr stood up from the table at approximately 0510 station time. He stretched, a simple human physical gesture that seemed almost incongruously ordinary given the weight of the conversation that had just taken place. And then he looked around the room at all of us. We should return to our ship, he said. We will be in communication with your council in preparation for the summit. Station Commander Seleth, I want to thank you for receiving us tonight. You handled a situation that was designed to be unexpected, with more equanimity than most would have. Seleth rose from her chair. You designed it to be unexpected, she said. Not quite an accusation, more of an observation. We needed to know how the first point of contact would go, he said. Whether we would be heard, or whether we would be immediately treated as a threat to be managed. The answer matters for everything that follows. And what is your assessment? Selath asked. He looked at her steadily. Cautiously positive, he said. Which is better than we had planned for, honestly. He extended his hand. She shook it again. Then Lydia Holt shook hands with Orvin, who handled it with the careful attention of someone performing a gesture they had researched in the last few hours, and wanted to get right. Patrick Gaines paused in front of me as the delegation moved toward the docking bay. He said, The star chart on your wall is wrong, by the way. Not just about us. A lot of it is wrong. There are things out there your survey teams have not been to in decades, and things have changed. He said it without any particular emphasis, as a statement of fact rather than a criticism. We thought you should know that too. Then he followed his colleagues out of the room. I stood in the doorway of the conference room and watched them go down the corridor toward the docking bay. 3 humans walking with that same unhurried, deliberate ease they had shown from the first moment the transport hatch opened. Not rushing, not looking back, simply going where they were going with the absolute certainty of people who knew exactly where that was. The transport undocked at 0527 and returned to the lead ship without navigational assistance. 32 ships remained at the edge of scanner range. None of them moved. I went back to my post and I sat down and I pulled up the star chart that covered our sector, the same chart Gaines had been looking at all night, and I looked at the small, lightly annotated region at the rim where human space was marked. 47 worlds, unmarked on this chart, unknown to the official record, built in silence, while the galaxy was busy being certain that the matter had been resolved. I reached for the controls to update the chart, and then I stopped, because I realized that the chart was not mine to update. That was going to take a formal process, a summit on a world called New Kaleth, a reckoning that was going to unfold over months or years, a rewriting of the official record that would require the coalition to admit things it had spent 26 years not admitting. But the chart in my own mind, the one that I carried in my understanding of the galaxy I lived in, I could update that right now. I did. Outside, the human ships held their position as the station rotated slowly through its orbit, and the stars moved in their long, patient arcs, and somewhere in the direction the scanner still labeled as the rim, 47 worlds were waking up to a morning that was also a beginning, the first day of the part of the story where the galaxy finally learned to count carefully. I stayed at my post until the shift change. The stone that had been in my chest since 0347 was gone now. Not because the situation was resolved, it was far from resolved. Not because the anxiety of the night had been answered by certainty, it hadn't. But because something that had been sealed and covered and deliberately made invisible for 26 years was now open, and in the open air, even the most complicated things can at least be looked at clearly. And looking at things clearly, I had learned that night, was exactly what the humans had been waiting for us to do. They had been very patient. They had been, it turned out, far more patient than they needed to be. Because in the end, what they brought to Meridian 7 was not a weapon, and not a threat, and not even a demand, in the way the word is usually meant. What they brought was something far more difficult to defend against, and far more impossible to seal into an archive and classify as resolved. They brought the truth. They brought it carefully, and quietly, and in numbers that made turning away from it not a practical option. They brought it the way people bring something they have been carrying for a very long time, with the particular mix of relief and gravity that comes from finally setting it down in the right place. The galaxy had made its calculations. It had looked at a young, loud, energetic species from a rim world and decided what they were. It had filed the assessment. It had sealed the file. It had moved on to other concerns and called the chapter closed. It had forgotten to account for one variable, and that variable was the most important one. The humans had not agreed that the chapter was closed. And in the end, in the absolute arithmetic of history, that was the only thing that mattered. The chapter was not closed. It had just been waiting for someone to turn the page. They turned it. And the galaxy, all of it, from the coalition councils to the border outposts to the carefully annotated and incorrectly drawn star charts, would spend the next generation learning what was written on the other side. I was there on the first page. I do not think I will ever stop being grateful for that.